The Living Zen-podcast is a gift from the members and associates of the Victoria Zen Centre to you. If you enjoy it, please be sure to let your friends know about Living Zen. If you'd like to support our community, here are a few ways that you can do it. Download the Living Zen podcast app for iPod, iPhone, or Android. You can also purchase additional Zen Talks by Venerable Eshu on iTunes or Amazon.com. One of the most meaningful ways to show your support is by joining our Sangha as an associate. Your commitment of $10 a month will ensure that offerings like the Living Zen podcast and our online e-Zendo will continue to be available around the world to everyone with an interest in truly living Zen. To become an associate, please visit our website at www.zenwest.ca and click on the membership tab. Thank you for your support. Mumonkan Case 42, Manjushri and the Young Woman in Samadhi. Once Manjushri went to a place where many Buddhas had assembled with the world-honored one. When he arrived, all the Buddhas had returned to their original dwelling place. Only a young woman remained, seated in Samadhi near the Buddha's seat. Manjushri addressed the Buddha and asked, "How can a young woman get near the Buddha's seat when I cannot?" The Buddha replied to Manjushri, "Awaken this young woman from her samadhi and ask her yourself." Manjushri walked around the young woman 3 times, snapped his fingers once, took her to the Brahma heaven and exerted all his supernatural powers, but he could not bring her out. The world-honored one said, "Even 100,000 Manjushris cannot awaken her." Down below, past 1,200 million lands, as innumerable as the sands of the Ganges, lives the Bodhisattva Jaliniprabha. He will be able to bring her out of her samadhi. Instantly, the Bodhisattva Jaliniprabha burst forth from the earth and made bows before the world-honored one, who gave him his command. Jaliniprabha stepped before the young woman, snapped his fingers once, and at this she came out of samadhi. Wu Men says, "Old Shakyamuni put on a rustic farce this time, which cannot be easily understood. Manjushri is the teacher of the 7 Buddhas. Why couldn't he bring the young woman out of samadhi? Jaliniprabha is a bodhisattva at the beginning level. How could he bring her out? If you can grasp this completely, you will realize that surging, delusive consciousness is nothing other than the greatest samadhi." Wu Men's verse says, "One can bring her out, the other cannot. Both of them are free. A ghost mask, a devil's mask, the failure is an elegant performance." Okay, so I spent a really long time talking about this case last week and got through pretty much the whole case part. I didn't get into the comments or verse, and I said that I would pick up. My hope is that everyone got my message and that they've had an opportunity to listen to this if you weren't here last Sunday. And maybe even if you were here last Sunday, you took the opportunity to listen to the talk from last week. I also did as well, because it's not always easy to remember what I said about something from the previous week. So don't want to repeat myself too much. We have, just to sum up in this case, what I called last week a crystal cavern, or a case in which every word and every image is pointed and is a very skillfully crafted tool that points to realization in our own practice. In this case, we have the complete universe carved up into discrete bits so that we can look at them, so that we can look at these dynamic activities which exist, which take place in every thing, in every living being, in every object, in every experience. We find these activities, these manifestations, as they're expressed through these personalities, through these characters in this drama. Buddha, the manifestation of complete awakening. We have Manjushri, the personification of prajna, absolute wisdom. We have the Bodhisattva Jaliniprabha, who's the personification of wisdom which is specific, or wisdom which is connected or enmeshed with differentiation. So one of the ways that this is expressed is delusive wisdom. But I kind of lean towards specific, wisdom of the specific. And then we have this wonderful character of the young woman in Samadhi, sitting near the Buddha's seat. And it is her very being, her very existence, her very manifestation and state which drives the whole drama forward. So as I said last week, we have in the characters, it reminds me of sort of like a sumo tournament, where on the one hand you've got the Bodhisattva Manjushri, and on the other hand you have the Bodhisattva Jaliniprabha, and the Buddha is sort of standing there as the referee, sort of watching this go on. And I guess maybe at the center of the ring is this young woman in Samadhi, right? And the task that's laid before both of these bodhisattvas, Manjushri starts it, is to bring her out of Samadhi, which is to, as I spoke about last week, this Samadhi is immersion, complete dissolution into the unfolding activity which is already present in each moment. Completely immersing, losing yourself in that experience. And I spoke about many different ways that this can arise. But we experience it for ourselves. We experience arising and dissolving into Samadhi over and over again throughout our lives. And if we practice in this formal way in the Zen tradition, we can experience it, and maybe have experienced it several times already today, just in the experience of walking into the Zendo. The first bow that we make as we walk into the Zendo is the first sort of entering into. We bow to a partner, to a mirror, that we're coming into this room. The whole act of the bow, gasho, bringing together left and right, bringing together these two things that we take as being separate and unifying, bringing together up and down and unifying, bringing together me, this myself, and the environment that I'm in, being two things, bringing them together and acknowledging them as unifying, dissolving into. We come and we sit down, and again we sort of make this bow, connecting ourselves, unifying, thanking, embracing the situation that we're in, sitting down into our zazen, and we take up the sit. We start to sit. And in the beginning of our day on Sunday, we start with some tea. And again, these little relationships, unification, happens over and over again. Each of these bows, when the shoji comes in with incense and tea, bowing to the jikijitsu, this whole activity of the way that we pass the incense between the shoji and the jikijitsu in the ceremony, it's one gasho is made. So we're recognizing that this gesture of palm to palm being made with two hands, just as we always make, but it's from two people, recognizing that there is this fundamental unification and there is this experience of dissolution. Then the shoji manifests themselves, the jikijitsu manifests themselves, coming together, coming apart, unification, diversification, bowing. Coming together again after the shoji has made their offering of incense, coming back offering tea. And again, there's this bow at the beginning of the line. And there's an intimate relationship that takes place through the serving of tea, in which the people serving and the people being served are unified. Their concentration is pointed. Their concentration unifies them in a single activity of tea being served. We can say there is a server and there is a recipient, a servee. But if even for a moment, either one of those two individuals has a thought of self, has a concern about what I need to do next or what I haven't done correctly, well, we all have seen and we all know what happens when there is this ripple. The structure of the form is so tight that we all get to see these little breaks, these little manifestations of self as they arise. And when the shoji does this service of tea, that concentration, that unification, that dissolution into a walking, into a moving samadhi continues this one activity of the service of tea until they come to the end of the line. And after they've served the last person, again, they stand up and bow, and the last person in line bows, and they stand facing each other. Having come to completion in the activity, there is this diversification that takes place again. Everybody drinks their tea. Then we move on to the next thing, chanting. After we've finished our tea, we put our cups away, we start to chant. And again, we have this activity of diversification, unification, diversification, unification. The densu who's leading the chanting starts off very prominent role, ringing bells, pong, pong, and this very strong voice, affirming faith mind, very distinct. There's a very clear manifestation of an individual distinct self, but that distinct self is an invitation. And that final sound that they make, is this invitation for dissolution, the invitation for the minus activity. And as we hear it, we actually, if we're sensitive, you can actually feel yourself already falling in. And so when we hear that sound and we open our mouths and we take a breath and we give our sound to that, meeting that sound, then we actually can physically, emotionally, entirely experience this dissolution, this falling into, this complete dissolving, absorption, if you like, into the sound of chanting. And even it's like the densu holds that note for the whole breath, and everyone falls into it. And then in the next breath, the densu even falls into it, and all together we engage in this activity of chanting. And even in the course of chanting, we have this experience where the chant comes to an end, and out of this unification arises distinction again. The densu pipes up and sings the dedication or the next introduction to the next chant. And as we go forward into formal practice, into just Zazen, we have this experience over and over again where the period of meditation starts and the entire activity that we're engaged in is just immersion, just the dissolution into the unfolding activity of what's taking place in this very moment. The sensations across the body, the emotions inside, the smells and the sights and the sounds, all of these things arising simultaneously, and we just dissolve without thoughts of I, or what do I need to do, or all these things. And we find that we can sink quite deeply, dissolve quite deeply into just the clear experience of this very moment. And then at the end of a period there is the sound of a bell. And when the bell sounds, it's like a rooster crowing in the morning. That this experience which has become unified, which has dissolved throughout the period of seated meditation, where breath and all of the activity that's taking place in this environment, the environment itself, have become one. And then there's this bell, which is a call like to be born. Ping! And we can feel sometimes, we can feel this resistance. We can feel like, oh, now it's like the gravity is greater. We've got to stand up. We've got to manifest. We've got to be born into our bodies. The self must arise so that we can walk, so that we can engage in this activity of plus, of being born, of acting. And so we start to do this. We start to get up and walk, and the resistance is there. And we go, oh, I really like that dissolution. We start to walk. And for me, this is a bit more difficult, I think, for many people. When we start to do walking meditation, there is also this difference in experience between I am walking, and we're really focused, we're really engaged in the I being aware and conscious of what I'm doing with my feet and how that relates to what everyone else is doing with my feet, with their feet. And then there's a transformation that takes place in walking where there is no more thought about it. There is a visceral feeling of the rhythm of the walking meditation. The walking is taking place. And you don't need to think about that walking so much anymore. All you need to do is once again dissolve. Just melt into the activity of walking which is already taking place, and you find the rhythm. You find complete dissolution in the activity of walking, even though we're walking around completely dissolved into walking Samadhi. Okay, so over and over and over again, in this formal practice that we're engaged in, we have these two activities manifest over and over again. And we find that when we are fixated on self, they're both difficult. When we fixate the self, which is obsessed with action, with acting, then we find that chanting is difficult. We find that the sitting meditation is difficult. We find that walking meditation is difficult. And when we find that we are manifesting samadhi, when we're letting go into these experiences of sitting and chanting and walking meditation, we find that transition is difficult. That the activity, the action of being born, transforming from one situation to the other, is difficult, and we don't want to do it. If you've ever had this experience where you'll be in a retreat or you're doing a sit, and you're sitting there going, oh God, I really wish this period would end and I could start walking meditation. And then that period ends and we start walking meditation, and you're walking around and the whole time you're thinking, oh God, it's cold and miserable out here, and I just wish we could get back to the Zendo and start the sitting meditation. And you can actually spend whole days like this, where the whole time you're always avoiding, you're holed up in the self, in the I am, in the self-concern, resistant to dissolving into the activity that you're engaged in at that time, whether it's sitting or chanting or walking or eating the meal. It's like everything is just an obstacle or a bus station to the next thing, which is just the bus station to the next thing, and you can never dissolve into the activity that you're engaged in. This is one position. And then there is another position of fixation in which everything that you're doing is wonderful. The sitting, beautiful. The chanting, beautiful. Walking, beautiful. Eating the meals, transcendent. And yet there is this subtle annoyance, disruption, or maybe even anger, or even sadness or a sense of loss when these transitions happen. As I'm sitting, the bell rings and I feel sad or angry that I've got to now leave this place. I've got to leave this home, this abode of dissolution, of samadhi, to transform, to transition, to be born into this body, this self, to take the next step, to do the next thing. Okay, so what we have here in this case is these two fundamental activities, the activity of dissolution minus completion, unification, wisdom which is not specific, prajna, that which comes before, unified wisdom, zero, manifested, personified through Manjushri Bodhisattva. And we have the activity, the wisdom which is transformation itself, which is to act, which is the plus activity, manifested, personified through the Bodhisattva Jaliniprabha. And we have a being, this young woman, in a state of samadhi, completely dissolved, unified in this space. And the challenge is, how can you bring her out of samadhi? And the Bodhisattva Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of complete dissolution, the very depths of prajna, exerting all of his powers, making the biggest show that he possibly can, transporting this woman to different realms, exerting himself to his utmost, can't do a thing. The Bodhisattva Jaliniprabha, this first rank, level 1 Bodhisattva of specific wisdom, the personification of the activity of this transformation, this transition that takes place between samadhi, just steps in front of her and snaps his fingers. Immediately she arises. Each of us, and I think myself included, and I think it's very difficult not to in this case, it's very much set up that way. We sort of come into this and we like to pick a horse. We like to pick our preference, or what we think is right, or what we think is strongest or best or correctest, the most positive person or situation in this case, and we sort of lay all of our money down on that horse. For me, especially in the beginning of my practice, Manjushri is like, he's like, if Manjushri's in the race, I'm betting on him. And so in this case, I lay my money on Manjushri, and man, it's really frustrating to watch your horse come in last when really, I mean, there's no possible way that should happen. But the import of this case, as with all cases, is to recognize over and over again that we identify ourselves as this thing, I am. We identify ourselves as having this capacity, but not that capacity. This capability, but not that capability. And over again, Buddhism points to us and says, you are human. You're a human being. And as such, as existent in this cosmos, you have as your capacity all things. You are the manifestation of Buddha, but you don't realize it. All that you need to do is wake up. You are the Bodhisattva Manjushri. You are the Bodhisattva Jaliniprabha. You are the woman sitting in Samadhi. Now, when we grasp this, my teacher used to always say, when we start to practice, I think that we have these ideas about enlightenment or about states of mind. And as we sit, we can experience different states. And as we sit, we can experience this samadhi in which all things simultaneously dissolve, where we can hear the sound of the bird and recognize that we are not separate. We are the sound of the bird. There is no I outside of the experience of the bird singing. And so the question is, how does this manifest? How are we able to act as the sound of the bird? How do we act to be of benefit to all beings when we are this sound of the bird? This experience of unification is of crucial importance in Zen Buddhist practice. To awaken, to not just understand the world as intimately connected, as completely unified, as an intellectual concept, is not the point, but to experience that through the manifestation of samadhi. And when we do this, when we have this experience, when we fall into this stream, this activity that's unfolding before us as our lives, there is this tendency to say, this is it. How wonderful. And to juxtapose it or to oppose it to our lives as distinct individuals. And we often make this comparison. We say, this experience of unification, of unconditional love, of complete immersion in this unfolding activity is much better, far superior, much more pleasant in every way than the experience of what it is to be a unique, differentiated I am self walking around in the world. And so we get people that have been called all kinds of names like emptiness junkies and things like that. That, all of life, all of your relationships, all of your activities, all of your hobbies and tools and objects and possessions just become totally irrelevant because it's all nothing and it's all one in this experience of unification. And so we spend all of our time trying to get back to this experience of unification. And my teacher used to often say, this manifestation of one, unification, one true nature, Buddha nature, awakening, unconditional love. God is wonderful, very important. But there are no restaurants, and there are no washrooms, toilets, so you can't stay. The significance of this case is that we seem to always want things to be one way or the other, and that this is not reflective of either our experience or of how this cosmos behaves, this activity. We find that there are these two activities of dissolution and arising, differentiation, unification, differentiation, death and birth. And as we continue to practice, more and more as we immerse ourselves in both of these activities, for most of our lives, before we come to practice, many people are obsessed with this activity of birth, becoming, acquiring more and more demonstrations of differentiation, more and more individual, distinct things, bigger things, smaller things, more things. And then we discover in practice unification, the great leveler, dissolution, zero, oneness. And we become obsessed with that, and we say, this is what's really important, not that other differentiation stuff. And what these teachings press on us over and over again is that the activity is fluid. Unification, diversification, death and birth. We sit down for a time, and then it becomes time to arise and act. We walk for a time, and then it becomes time to bow and sit down. Over and over and over again. This is the formal way that we can look at it in formal practice. But when we take this perspective to our lives, absolutely everything in our lives follows this simple activity. Whether it's our relationship with children, the children themselves, our employment, our day-to-day activities, and our very lives, we find that there is this constant ebb and flow, this constant falling into, dissolving into an activity, an experience, that activity transforming. We manifest, we make choices. We look at things from the perspective of being different, having distinct relationships and distinct situations. The more that we're able to really readily transform, the more that we're able to readily call upon what's required in any given situation, the less suffering, the less difficulty, the less resistance, fear, anger, grief, longing, all of these things crop up in our lives. Overall, the less we suffer and the less suffering we impose on the people around us in our world. This is what our case last week and today is pressing upon us. Old Shakyamuni put on a rustic farce this time, which cannot be easily understood. Women, I think it's important to point out that this is case 42 in Women's collection of cases. So as much as it is Shakyamuni directing the drama, Women is responsible for putting this in front of us, sharing this little drama with us. And it's, he says it's not easily understood, but he also calls it a rustic farce, which is to indicate that it's coarse. It's so, in some ways, it's so obvious. It's so blunt. It's like, I don't know, it's like maybe the local theater company's version of a Shakespeare play or something like this. Very simplified, very broken down. But we have to take the time to understand the theme, what the point, the underlying sort of message that's being brought across here. And I've already covered a lot of this stuff. Manjushri is the teacher of the 7 Buddhas. Why couldn't he bring the young woman out of Samadhi? He's called the teacher of the 7 Buddhas because this primary virtue of wisdom, prajna, that the wisdom that comes before, is one of the paramitas, or one of the crucial virtues that manifests in a Buddha. Jaliniprabha is a bodhisattva at the beginning level. So he's just a newbie bodhisattva, level 1 bodhisattva. How could he, what is it that he does, what is it that he is that allows him to bring her out of Samadhi? If you can grasp this completely, you will realize that surging, delusive consciousness is nothing other than the greatest Samadhi. Now this really ties into this line. Instantly the Bodhisattva Jaliniprabha burst forth, or as my other translation says, gushes forth from the earth. And this is a direct connection to his manifestation. You realize that this thing that we, when we experience samadhi, when we experience prajna, when we experience wisdom, we recognize the self as being a form of delusion, the idea of a subjective, differentiated self. But what Wumen is pointing to here is that instead of juxtaposing wisdom, instead of juxtaposing unification against that and saying, oh, this one is good and that one is bad, we recognize that this surging delusive consciousness is the active manifestation of prajna, that we cannot, from samadhi, from the complete immersion in unification, we can't do anything. There's nothing to be done. So as soon as we step into the world of things to be done, into the world of doing, we are manifesting. We are manifesting Jaliniprabha. We're manifesting as a differentiated bodhisattva who acts. Wumen's verse says, one can bring her out, the other cannot. Both of them are free. Free to act. Free to remain inactive. A ghost mask, a devil mask. This is often translated a god mask and a devil mask, but it's not accurate. It's a ghost mask and a devil mask. And I thought this was very funny because last week was Halloween. So to talk about these masks, but in any way, I talk about this often as human beings, as bodhisattvas, as Buddhas, is to understand that by practicing, we're not just developing the capacity to do one thing all the time. A person who only has the capacity to say really nice things all the time is not a complete person. And I've often spoken about the experience of coming into a relationship with a Zen master as being quite frightening, because the capacity is there for all forms of behavior, all forms of activity. There is no limitation. And so when you come into the Sanzen room, when you come into the interview room with a Zen master, you really don't know what to expect. It can go this way and it can go that way. And it should be said that we all choose to do certain things and not to do certain things. But that it's very important for us to understand that as human beings, we have as our capacity all things. We have as our capability the ability to save lives. We have as our capability the ability to condemn people to gas chambers in large numbers. This is a terrifying realization. This is a terrifying thing that we must come to terms with. This is also, though, a incredibly empowering realization. We are free to transform to meet whatever the situation requires, whatever our purpose is. We have this significant power as human beings to fit, to manifest appropriately for the situation. As we engage in practice, as we take up these vows to be of benefit to all sentient beings, bodhisattva to be awakening beings, we have to recognize that we are unlimited in our capacity to bring this to fruition, that we are capable of complete unification and dissolution, and complete and wholehearted, unrestrained manifestation. The failure, talking about the case now, Manjushri's failure is an elegant performance. I'm not going to say anything about that because it's just a final comment that allows us to see that this whole thing that we have just experienced, this whole scene, this whole case, has been compassionately exposed for our benefit. Thanks for listening to the Living Zen podcast. If you follow Living Zen through iTunes, I would very much appreciate it if you would take a moment to let me know what you think about it by rating or reviewing the podcast, so that new listeners can also hear what you have to say. Thank you for your time and for your support.